اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ما بعد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Dear beloved friends, brothers and sisters, welcome to our weekly discussion on Fiqh al-Mu'amalat, where we are reading al-Durr al-Mukhtar, and we are still in the opening section of Kitab al-Buyur. So, قال المصنف رحمه الله ورضي عنه, he says, فالإيجاب هو ما يذكر أولا من كلام أحد المتعاقدين. He begins to now discuss what are the integrals of a transaction. What is it that executes a transaction and brings a transaction into life? He mentions the first thing, al-ijab, which is, according to the Hanafi scholars, anything, any kalam which is mentioned first from any party. Ijab is not restricted to the seller or the buyer. It's any party which makes an offer. An offer can be made by the buyer. An offer can be made by the seller. That will be deemed to be ijab from a fiqh perspective. والقبول ما يذكر ثانيا من الآخر سواء كإن بعت أو اشتريت. And qabul is the word that we use for the acceptance, regardless whether it is the seller or the buyer saying and responding to the counterparty. So qabul can be from any party, just like ijab can be from any party. And this is what we call offer and acceptance. Offer and acceptance is also found in English law. In fact, in every legal system, in contract law, you have offer and acceptance amongst many other requirements and conditions, such as consideration, for the execution of a transaction. Then he mentions ad-dal ala-taradi. He mentions that this transaction, this bay that we're talking about, it is composed of, it's mubadala ala wajhin makhsus. It can be with qawl or fa'al. Qawl happens with ijab and qabul. Then he mentioned what is ijab and qabul. He mentioned that. But ad-dal ala-taradi, it has to be something which is indicating to consent. That's the kind of meaning behind this, that there must be mutual consent between both parties to execute this transaction. Now, what does that mean, right? And why is that the case? And where does it fit into our discussions when we were saying that if we discussed last week that for a transaction to be valid, right, for a transaction to be formulated, the asl has to be there, the core integrals. And we mentioned that refers to the ijab and qabul, and scholars have added the subject matter, the mabi and the thaman. If these four are absent, then the integral is not there, the core is not there, and therefore there is no transaction. Thereafter, there's other matters which are peripheral, such as ambiguity, no ambiguity, no gharar. Similarly, there has to be some kind of faida, which we discussed last week, some benefit, some kind of economic gain, or some utility being acquired through this transaction. But also up here, they're mentioning taradi. There must be consent. Because why is taradi? If there's no taradi, a transaction will still be munaqid, but it will be fasid, meaning a transaction will still be deemed to have taken place, however, it will be voidable. As you mentioned, the integrals and the core of a transaction are ijab, qabul, the subject matter, and the thaman. These are all found. However, there is no rida, there is no consent. When there is no consent, then we can't say that the core integral is missing, because that's already there. Rather, consent is missing. And why is consent then a peripheral matter, something which is made from the wasf, right? It's because the counterparties are not consenting to and are not pleased with the effect of the transaction. They're not happy that this transaction, the way it's being performed, they don't want the effect of the transaction to transpire and manifest, which is tamlik. That's why in Bay'ul Fasid, tamlik does not take place until qabd occurs. And the reason why qabd, possession, results in Bay'ul Fasid is because qabd carries with it risk. So because risk is then transferred, we'll say, because risk has now transferred, milkiya is transferred at that very point. However, both parties have to cancel the transaction. So because both parties, a taradi is not there, a wasf is missing. Just like jahala is a wasf, right? Jahala is a wasf. There's ambiguity. It's a wasf. No fa'ida being there. It's a wasf. It's something which is an outcome. Whereas ijab, qabul, mabi and thaman are not awsaf. They're actual, clear, verbal or physical performances and items. Whereas awsaf are things which are meanings, feelings, experiences. And so here, although we're saying awsaf are those things which are connected to, but it's like these emotions are connected to these subject matters. The emotions, the mental state, the feelings, the experience is not of a positive one. And therefore we're saying the transaction cannot occur. The core is there, but the surrounding process is not fitting for the transaction. And that's why we'll say it will be fasid, although the core and integral requirements are found. Then he says, قيد به اقتداء بالآية وبيانا للبيع الشرعي. Why has he put this additional الدالة للتراضي? Not all the fuqaha mention this additional clause when describing the definition of bay'. Not everybody mentions this الدالة للتراضي. Rather, most of them, they either say مبادلة المال بالمال, or like he's mentioned here, مبادلة شيء مرغوب فيه بمثله, along those lines. But Imam al-Mutashi rahimahullah, he's added this الدال التراضي. Why has he done that? So Imam al-Haskafi rahimahullah, he mentions, potentially he's mentioned this because قيد به, he's brought this clause in اقتداء بالآية. He's following the verse of the Quran, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? إلا أن تكون تجارة عن تراض منكم, in Surah An-Nisa. He's potentially added this taradi because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions tijara and taradim. So it's as though tijara, this mubadala, it's connected with taradi, and tabarrukan, seeking blessings from the verse of the Quran and trying to benefit metaphysically and spiritually from there, he adds this into the definition of sale. And there are وَبَيَانًا لِلْبَيْعِ الشَّرْعِ. He mentions also that this is not only has he done iqtida bil ayah, but he is also clarifying what a bay' shar'i is. And what do we mean by bay' shar'i? Not a lughawi, a transaction in terms of language, rather in terms of sharia and istilah, a bay' shar'i, that refers to a transaction which is fulfills all the criteria, whether that's to do with the asal, the core, the integrals, the awsaf, and the matters of jiwar, which we mentioned, such as no karaha being there whatsoever. Right? That's what a bay' shar'i is. A bay' shar'i in its absolute form, a sale, a transaction in its absolute form, in its best form, is that where there's no infringement, neither at an integral level, at a core level, neither at a peripheral level, neither at an adjacent parallel level. Every single layer, there is no infringement. That will be legally a mubah transaction. Yes, you can add to that and make it a mustahab transaction if it's empowering. There may be certain scenarios where You can do additional things where you're helping, or you are doing something beyond just a trade and transaction. You may be fulfilling something in advance, or helping somebody, where it could become mustahab, right? Depending on the circumstance and the scenario. But this is legally and technically, as long as there's no infringement at any layer, any level, that will be bay shar'i. وَلِذَا لَمْ يَلْزَمْ بَيْعُ الْمُكْرَهِ. He's mentioned وَإِنِ عَقَدْ. Now he's mentioning, look, if taradi is a requirement, and we were saying consent is a requirement, then bay'ul mukrah will not be binding, because remember, bay'ul fasid is not binding. Whenever a bay' fasid takes place, a voidable transaction, then that is not binding. Rather, both parties have the right to raise this and to have it cancelled. They can cancel the transaction and withdraw. That's their duty bound to do that. So he's saying that when it comes to a bay' mukrah, when one party is coerced and forced into a transaction, because there's no taradi there, because the coerced individual is not consenting to the outcome of this transaction, therefore the sale will not result in the transfer of ownership. So it'll be munaqid, meaning there'll be a sale because the integrals were found. There was an ijab, there was a qabul, there was a sale item, there was a payment. However, because the buyer was not happy, or the seller was not happy, therefore the transaction will be non-binding. Rather, both parties will have the right. This is what we mean by non-binding. When we say something is binding, we mean that no party can unilaterally cancel and withdraw and terminate the transaction. That's what it means by luzum, that no party can unilaterally cancel the transaction. However, when it's lam yalzam, when it's not binding, when there's no luzum, that means either party has the right to unilaterally cancel the transaction. Whereas when it's binding, like a normal sale or a normal ijara, once it's been executed, you cannot then unilaterally cancel. You'll have to have mutual agreement to cancel the transaction. Then he mentions وَلَمْ يَنْعَقِدْ مَعَ الْهَزْلِ لِعَدَمِ الرِّضَى بِحُكْمِهِ مَعَهُ. He mentions this, however, this is debated amongst the Hanafi fuqaha, Hamawi, Tahtawi, Ibn Abidin rahimahumullah. They've all discussed this in detail, that some fuqaha have gone, because the word fasid is used in the books of fiqh at times to mean batil also. So fasid is like a global term, but is sometimes used in the meaning of batil, and batil is then sometimes used as well. So the books, there seems to be some debate on hazl. If a transaction had taken place in jest, right, without intent, without any intent, it was just in jest. Two parties, they came together, they had agreed. Before that, there was some kind of like a pre-agreement or pre-discussion that this transaction which we enter into, it's purely hazlan, and it's purely just as a joke. There's no reality to it, and we don't want the legal implications of it. And they then go and do the transaction. Because both parties were not happy with the legal transfer of ownership, with tamlik and tamalluk, therefore the fuqaha mention that this transaction will not result in the transfer of ownership. Now, is it munaqid or not? It is munaqid, but it will be bay' fasid, because rida is missing. Rida is from the wasf, awsaf, it's not from the asl. So it is munaqid. Up here, when he says wala min aqid, he is referring to those who are saying that it is batil based on the writings of fuqaha who use batil and fasid interchangeably. So they thought it was referring to batil. However, up here it's fasid, just like bay'ul mukrah. Yes, there's a potential scenario where it can be lam yanaqid, which would be if both the parties are doing hikayah. If both parties are doing hikayah of ijab and qabul, which means that they are not saying ijab and qabul in sha'an, Rather, they're doing hikayatan. They are just saying those words. They're reading it from a script, right? And they're just acting as a role play, and it's purely as a hikayah. It's not in the meaning of insha. Then you could argue that it will not be munaqid whatsoever, because bay needs insha. Even the wordings are in the meaning of insha, and when there's no insha, you can't have a transaction. Then he mentions هذا ويرد على تعريفين ما في التطرخانية. These two terminologies that he's given, that ijab is the first thing and qabul is the second thing, there is an objection that's raised based on what's mentioned in Tatarkhaniya and other books, where he mentions that لو خرج معا صح البيع, if both words were to be uttered together, the sale will go through. لكن في القهستاني لو كان معا لم ينعقد. However, Kuhustani says, no, if they were together, it will not be munaqid. كما قالوا في السلام, just like the debate is in when people say salam, right? Is salam sufficient when somebody replies instantaneously or simultaneously to you? وعلى الأول ما في الأشباه تكرار الإيجاب مبطل للأول. And if you go with the first kind of understanding, then what we'll say is that when you are repeating ijab, then it'll be as though the takrar, when there's repetition, it will nullify and make the second statement. So the second statement will become the new ijab. And so the previous statement will become nullified altogether. The previous statement will become nullified altogether. And any transaction that takes place will be on the last utterance. So it's as though in a sale, when there is takrar, or when there is a repetition of ijab, it's not that the second is qabul, rather it's ijab which has then nullified the first ijab. And so even the second one will be ijab. إلا في إتق وطلاق الأعمال وسيجيء في الصلح. Yeah, there's some examples and some scenarios and exceptions whereby in some masail that the second will not be batil, rather the first will not be batil, rather the first will remain and stand. Okay, the first utterance, the first ijab, so to speak, will remain and it will be considered. Whereas in a bay, if the mujib, the person doing ijab, he repeats the ijab, his first ijab is no longer consequential, it's no longer considered, it's dropped, it's nullified altogether. But there are some performances, some transactions, which when the ijab is repeated, then the first ijab will still be considered, it will not be disregarded and discontinued. And the whole discussion will come in sulh. And he mentions this up here, في المنظومة المحبية. He mentions this line of poetry, or these few lines of poetry, which says وكل عقد بعد عقد جدد فأبطل الثاني لأنه سدى فالصلح بعد الصلح أضحى باطلا وكذا النكاح ما عدا مسائل من الشراء بعد الشراء صحه كذا كفالة على ما صرحه. So he mentions here that whenever a transaction is repeated, then really the second one, فَأَبْطِلِ الثَّانِ لِأَنَّهُ سُدَى. Then, no, this is not talking about bait, this is just general performances and transactions. Transactions we meaning globally and as an umbrella term. When transactions are done, then, and they repeated, you cancel the second one, it's suda. It has no kind of legal implication and legal consequence. فَالصُّلْحُ بَعْدَ الصُّلْحِ أَضْحَى بَاطِلًا. An example is sulh. If there's a settlement, after settlement, so there's two settlements on the same things that are being discussed, then the second one will be disregarded and not considered. Likewise, nikah. If a man and woman do nikah and then they re-perform the nikah, the second nikah has no legal implication because nikah was already performed, it's done from the first transaction or from the first kind of engagement and discussion that they had. Ma ada masaila, there are some exceptions to this. Then he mentions min hashira بعد الشراء صحه. One is shira, sales, sale after a sale. كذا كفالة لما صرحه إذ المراد صاح في محقق منها إذا زيادة التوثق. He's now mentioning that shira, kafala, and another one that's not mentioned here is ijara. In these scenarios, if there is a repetition and the transaction is repeated, then the second one will be considered. What they agree in the second transaction will be considered as part of the transaction. It'll be as though they've renegotiated terms, and the second one will be regarded. Likewise, he says, كذا كفالة لما صرحوا إذ المراد صاح في المحقق منها إذا زيادة التوثق. He's saying that even in kafala, there's a meaning and purpose. If kafala is repeated, then there should be a purpose and objective, and that is زيادة التوثق. You want to make sure that the contract is secure. It's been secured properly. There's a guarantor there, and all the kind of like liabilities have been covered properly. And that's what is meant here. So sale, kafala, ijara, these, when they are repeated, the repeated transaction has legal implications and consequences. However, other performances, exchanges, or transactions, if they are repeated, then the second one is void. It has no legal meaning and legal implication. وهما عبارة عن كل لفظين ينبئان عن معنى التملك والتمليك ماضيين. Now he starts talking about what is ijab and qabul. How are they uttered? In which phraseology, which format, which tense? Now all this now discussion will be specific to the Arabic language, or language which has only two words to capture three tenses typically. So as we know, the Arabic language has madi and mudari, right? The Arabic language has a past tense or mudari which captures both present and future tense. So a transaction can go through. What's the purpose up here? What we want to show is two parties who are certain and who want to engage in an aqd. Because if this goes to court, we need words which are clearly showing a sale transaction, clearly without any kind of ambiguity. So if we were to use mudari alone, without any kind of implication or indication of hal, then mudari can also mean the future. It can mean mustaqbil. However, that would result in a scenario where there's uncertainty in the law. We don't know if the parties were discussing a future agreement where they were saying, look, in future we'll do this. In future I'll sell this to you. In future you'll buy this from me, which has, of course, creates no legal implication or obligation at present. So if this contract was to be taken to the court of law and to any Islamic court, they would need to interpret this contract and transaction. And therefore, to give absolute certainty and for the avoidance of doubt, the Sharia has fixed madi as a term or as a tense for insha. That madi can be used to show, because madi is from the past, and anything that's happened in the past has happened with certainty. It's definitive, right? It's certainly happened. Nobody can erase that. It's for all intents and purposes. That's it's happened, it's taken place, and now nobody can object. And therefore, we use madi here because it gives the strongest indication of two parties wanting to transact. So when a contract is written in, an entire contract is written, or they're discussing, and in the Arabic language they were to use the words of madi, it would be known that they are discussing and dealing with certainty, that this is what they are doing now. This is the actual ijab. This is the actual qabul. Until then, it's just negotiations, just discussions. But when the phrase comes, for example, you're talking to somebody, a buyer or a seller, you're discussing, you're debating, and you say, okay, maybe I'll buy this, maybe I won't buy this. And then you say, okay, bi'tu, I've sold it to you. Only when he says that, he's going to the past. Immediately you'll know now this is legally an offer. Legally, this is an offer because he's used a tense, a past tense. Likewise, the buyer, when he says قبلت, or I've accepted this, or اشتريت, any word I use in the Arabic language, you know with certainty now, this is from this particular moment, transfer of ownership has taken place. That's why Madi was used. Or it could be Hal. Hal can be used as well, where you clearly indicate in the Arabic language that you are intending Hal, because from that moment, at this very moment in time, the buyer and the seller, they are intending to transfer ownership. There's no room for doubt. Okay, and that's what they mention here. كبعت واشتريت, which were examples of ماضي, or حالين كمضارعين لم يقرنا بسوف وسين كأبيئك فيقول أشتريه. Or like what any mudari which is not connected to which does not have seen and sofa, because seen and sofa gave the mudari a future meaning. So if that is not there, and there is evidence of something being meant for hal and for the present tense, then that will be acceptable and the transaction will also go through. أو أحدهما ماضٍ والآخر حال. If one is madi, one of the tenses, or one of the offer or the acceptance is madi, the second is hal in present tense, it will also go through. This is very specific to the Arabic language. In English, we have three tenses. We have I sold this to you, I am selling this to you, and I will sell this to you. So it's fine. This is to do with the urf of language. And so we can't use the Arabic kind of principles up here, which are specific to the Arabic language, to another language. Yes, every contract, every language and every urf has its own way to indicate the transfer of ownership. As long as that is maintained and abided to, and that's the kind of like legal practice, then it's fine, it'll be accepted. From the fiqh up here, there's just certain principles. One is of certainty. We need to know with certainty when the ijab is taking place. We need to know with certainty when the qabul is taking place. We need to know with certainty when there's a transfer of ownership. Whichever words indicate to that certainty, it'll be acceptable. Any word which does not give a certainty is not acceptable. And that's what's being meant up here. ولكن لا يحتاج الأول إلى نية بخلاف الثاني. Yes. فإن نوابل إيجاب للحال صح على الأصح وإلا فلا. Right? Now, when it comes to niyyah, right? When you're using maldi, you don't need a niyyah. Okay? Because maldi only comes, the words of maldi, they only come for past tense and very clearly fixed for the execution of bay. So there's no need for an intention. However, when you're using mudari, then you would need an intention, because it can be, so if you're saying abi'uk or ashtari, because that has dual meaning, it can be hal or mustaqbil. It's like this example of kinaya, where in kinaya you can have a meaning which is not sarih. The meaning in madi is sarih. It's very clear. There's no ambiguity. However, when it's a mudari term, there's ambiguity. You don't know if the present is meant or the future is meant. That's why whenever you have a kinaya, the rule in fiqh is intention has to be made to kind of decipher what is actually being meant. And that's for you, obviously, very likely it will be manifested in the contract or manifested in your discussion. But if you were to be summoned to court, you know very clearly that this is what I meant. And this is what I said. Or if you were taken to a mufti for a discussion to kind of clarify, you need a niyyah, like this consciousness. You need some kind of conscience and some kind of like understanding and recollection of what exactly you meant when you were accepting, because this would be either a means of an entire transaction formulating or a transaction not formulating. So there needs to be clarity. And so that's what is meant by that. إلا إذا استعملوه للحال كأهل الخوارزم. Yeah, there's some scenarios where some words are used by the people in the urf for hal, and therefore there's no need for niyyah because it's fixed already. فكال ماضي, then in such scenarios it'll be in the meaning of madi. So again, this very clearly shows it's down to the people of the city and language and the urf however people use language to exchange, use language to fulfill their needs, that would be considered, because language is just a tool. Language is just a means. The asal is, and the objective is the transfer of ownership, doing exchanges. Language is just an aid. That's all it is. It's just aiding both parties to fulfill their needs in an optimal way, free from any dispute, and in the most kind of efficient, effective manner. That's why language is used, and there's all these guidelines and principles. Because if you never had these principles and guidelines, there'd be inefficiency. Many times transactions would be causing ambiguity, uncertainty, risk. So all these things in Sharia are not liked. Sharia likes transactions to be free of any ambiguity, free of uncertainty, free of any kind of disputing or any kind of matter and factor which results in dispute. And therefore we have all these kinds of requirements. وكبير الآن لتمحضه للحال، وأما المتمحض للاستقبال فكالأمر لا يصح أصلا إلا الأمر إذا دل على الحال فخذه بكذا، فقال أخذت ورضيت صح بطريق الاقتضاء فليحفظ أو فليحفظ. So now he's saying that there are scenarios where if something is an amr, is istiqbal, if you have a future tense, that's in the meaning of amr, which is not valid at all, because that's not doing insha of transaction. Rather, it's an injunction, it's an amr, right? It's another type of insha. It's not for the insha of an aqd. Except when the amr, the injunction or the command, the order is in the meaning of hal. Like, here you go, I'm selling this to you, take it now, right? Then, and the other party responds positively. He says, أخذت or رضيت, then it'll be acceptable. على طريق بطريق الاقتضاء. It'll be as though the seller is saying, خذه and أخذته, right? Or خذه, or he's saying take it, and then the other party is saying فقال أخذت, right? The other party is saying I've taken it. So it's as though اقتضاء, after خذه there'll be another fi'l which is saying that I am giving it to you, so take it. So فقال أخذت. Now that other fi'l can be in the meaning of, it could be a hal, right? It could be a hal, or it could be something else, any kind of verb which makes sense, fi'l that makes sense. You can put it اقتضاء, and therefore we'll say really it's an ijab and a qabul. The khudhu is just a dalil for selling, or it could be abi'uhu khudhu faqala akhadhtu, right? I'm selling this, so take it. Then so the other party says I've taken it, I'm happy with it, right? Again, this is for the Arabic language. In English, typically we don't use a lot of this terminology. Rather, we are if it's for day-to-day transactions, nothing is done now. There is no kind of exchange of phrases. It's just a bitta'ati through conduct. It's really through writing, when it's investments, when it's kind of financing transactions or important transactions which are written in written form. That's when language is there, and even then, based on legal convention, all the terms are defined in the contract very clearly, either in the beginning of a contract or in a schedule at the end. The terms and definitions of the words which are being used are mentioned in detail. Then he says, ويصح إضافته إلى عضو ويصح إضافة العتق إليه كوجه وفرج وإلا لا كظهر وبطن. Now he's just mentioning more things about the wajh makhsus. They mentioned previously that mubadala has to happen ala wajh makhsus. What's this wajh makhsus? It has to take place in a manner where it's clear what the sale transaction is. It has to be something where the sale item has to be clearly identified. What is it that you are referring to? So idafa has to be there. The ijab and qabul have to be clearly mudaf to and ascribed to something. The ijab and qabul have to be attributed to, or at least referencing or pointing, or some kind of like understanding of what the ijab and qabul is referring to. So idafa is necessary. And they're just giving an example here because in those times there would be trading of these servants And in that scenario, as long as you used an organ or a limb which reference the entire body and which you can use to free that servant, the transaction would take place. Of course, not applicable today, but just the key learning from here is that the phraseology has to be so clear that what exactly are you selling? It has to be very precise. وَإِلَّا لَا, if it's not precise, then the transaction will not go through. وَكُلُّ مَا دَلَّ عَلَى مَعْنَى بِعْتْ وَاشْتَرَيْتْ نَحْوَ قَدْ فَعَلْتْ وَنَعَمْ وَهَاتِ الثَّمَنِ وَهُوَ لَكَ وَعَبْدُكَ فِدَاكَ وَخُذْهُ قَبُولٌ. Whatever language is used and it indicates to the meaning of buying and selling bi'tu wa shtaraytu, meaning in the Arabic language you don't even have to use the words bi'tu wa shtaraytu, which are clearly for buying and selling. You can use any word in the meaning of buying and selling. So they're like synonymous with buying and selling almost. You can use them. So like fa'altu, na'am, hati thaman, huwa lak, all these words, although they are not saying buying and selling, and they're not literally in the meaning of buying and selling, but because they're in the meaning and context of buying and selling, they indicate to a transaction and trade. The meaning up here suffices because the hal is there, the kind of context is there, and these words can be accepted. That's for taysir purposes. This whole idea is for taysir, because people, we know mu'amalat is based on the concept of haja, fulfilling each other's needs. And when it's based on the concept of haja, then Sharia implements taysir as much as possible. Whenever something is underpinned by the philosophy of haja, Sharia will have taysir automatically there in most instances, most scenarios. That's why mu'amala has taysir in it, as opposed to other kind of like actions in Sharia. There's taysir, and this is another example of taysir, where you can use any language, any word can be used as long as the meaning is clear that it's in the meaning of buying and selling. You don't have to ritually use the words I bought and I sold. Any word will do. لكن في الوالجية, now he's mentioning another point up here, that in the book al-Walwalijiyya, it's a fatawa book, إن بدأ البائع فقبل المشتري بنعم لم ينعقد لأنه ليس بتحقيق وبعكسه صح لأنه جواب. He's just saying a point that in Walwalijiyya it's mentioned one thing, right, which is if the seller was starting with this ijab and the mushtari and qabul bi na'am, the mushtari, the buyer said na'am, it will not be accepted, because na'am in such an instance they're saying and arguing that it doesn't give the meaning of tahqiq. What do we mean by that? We mean that na'am is just it's not affirmative for the execution of sale. It's not affirmative. It's like, okay, I'm understanding. It's in that kind of, okay, I understand what you're saying. Na'am, let's carry on. It's not in the same meaning of qabiltu. Qabiltu is more firm and clearer than na'am. However, if it was the other way around, where the seller said na'am, then that would be accepted because that's jawab, right, in the Arabic kind of understanding. وفي القنية نعم بعد الاستفهام كهل بعت مني بكذا بيع إن نقد الثمن لأن النقد دليل التحقيق ولو قال بئته فبلغه يا فلان فبلغه غيره جاز فليحفظ. Again, some more just examples here where they're mentioning that there's a discussion if na'am was used after istifham, after a question, that do you sell this to me for this much, it'll be considered a transaction and sale if the counterparty, the buyer, he paid, because the question was whether the na'am meant tahqiq or not, and when he's giving payment he means tahqiq. So we're saying that there's dalalatul hal, because na'am is somewhat kinaya, it's got a dual meaning. It can be in the meaning of saying yes, I'm selling and I'm executing, or it can be in the meaning of maybe I'm not sure, let me think about it. When that's the case, then na'am needs some kind of external indicator to mean in the meaning of, yes, I'm buying or I'm selling, I'm transacting with you. And so when payment is made, we will say that appear a transaction was intended. Inshallah, we'll stop here. Subhanallah wa bihamdihi. Subhanakallah. Go to